companies go bankrupt all the time. In a capitalist society, it's actually okay. What ends up happening is that the debtors, the creditors lose their money. People lose money all the time. I'm in investments. You lose money all the time, but you do it voluntarily. You know, when I invest in a company and goes bankrupt, I do it voluntarily. But when you are not asked, but when you're forced to bail out a bankrupt company, that's the gun. That's government gun. That's what could be more immoral. I was at Northwestern University. I studying communications and philosophy. So I'd always had this fascination with philosophy. And, you know, these interesting basic questions of how does the world work? How should we understand the world around us? These basic choices that I think I always knew had a sense that were really important. And philosophy bored the hell out of me. What I read was Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which was basically like a Mad Max movie come to life, if you know anything about it.
I don't.
What I remember of it was just god awful. It was not only presented such an awful view of man and of the world, but left me feeling, as Plato did, or you might have read The Republic, this is what they have philosophy students read. And so all these philosophers we read, left me feeling more unsure, almost like I went to the doctor to try to get an answer,
right.
And I'm more unsure, more uncertain about myself, useless. You know, the story, there's a very famous philosopher whose name is Jürgen Habermas.
Of course it is.
You know that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if this is a big name, you know, he's German. I wouldn't believe it. I went and sat in his class. My parents paid a lot of money to go to Northwestern, and not only could I not understand a word, literally, I don't know if it was in German or transliteration or what it was, but I couldn't understand it. Just the whole view of philosophy as I understood it was so dark. That's the time someone said to me, "Oh, you need to get into Ayn Rand. You know, you need to read Ayn Rand." So, you know, the story is cliche. It's the old.
That's exactly. I don't know if this is what you're going to say. This is what I've heard with a lot of followers of the Ayn Rand philosophy, is that almost like it struck like a lightning bolt.
Yes.
They had either read one book or it was one interaction with the philosophy, and then it was all over.
Right. People say, you know, I read Ayn Rand and it changed my life.
Yeah.
I read Atlas
Elan
Shrugged.
said that. Elan Journo.
It's Elan Journo, and not people, you know, people who aren't even with the Ayn Rand Institute. I mean, Ayn Rand now, how many decades and decades after her death, sells 100,000 copies of her books every year.
Wow,
year
really?
after year after year. She's a bestseller year after year after year, and it's not because there's a great marketing campaign. Actually, the marketing's terrible for Ayn Rand. She's like a dirty word for most people. But the ideas that she presents are so powerful. For me, as a a lot of young people, you know, we can get into the slam. They always say, like, "Oh, it's just for young people. It's just for young people." It's you know, ideas are for young people. Young people are the ones who are idealistic. They're open to learning. They're open to new ideas. And Ayn Rand's ideas are so super powerful. So that's when I picked her up, and you know, have just been a happy student of Ayn Rand's ideas and objectivism. I just would say, I would say that objectivism has just improved my life. That's all I can say. I can say it's made my life better, made me more confident of who I am, made me have a much brighter, more benevolent, exciting, I think it's made me a much better businessman and trader, no question. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's a philosophy. So it's kind of, there's a lot to get into. There's a huge perspectives. The more I've learned about it, just the better my own life has become.
Yeah. And in short, because again, we had on Elan Journo, and he did a great job of giving us Ayn Rand's biography and a general overview of objectivism. But just for quick context, correct me if I'm wrong, but objectivism is essentially between the two principles, right, of individualism and collectivism?
Yes. Well, I mean, that is a great question, Michelle. I mean, that's what the book presents. I mean, objectivism is Ayn Rand's philosophy. So that stretches from everything from metaphysics to epistemology to ethics. Aesthetics. There's a lot to get into, and her corpus is enormous. If I may.
Yeah, yes, please. Of course, your book.
This book is, you know, a new textbook of Americanism. Mm-hmm. Is her perspective and her perspective specifically on politics. Mm-hmm. And you said it straight off. I mean, she starts this book with a very basic fundamental question. She says, what is the basic issue in the world today? What is the basic issue? Let's not talk about right or left or any, abortion or gun control. Just talk about the basics. So she starts defining Americanism. And that's, Americanism, I think, is up for grabs right now. It is unknown. It is by both parties. I just think that, and by Americans, I think there's just this complete ignorance about the basic fundamentals of what this country is about. I think it used to exist. It's been lost over many, many years. So she starts, as I said, not on policy, but with a very basic question. What is the basic principle in the world today? It is between individualism and collectivism. That's where you start with a philosophy, with a social system, and with a country.
Great. And about this book.
Yes.
So can you give me the history and the context of this book? Because that's kind of cool in and of itself. Thank
you. Yeah, thanks for asking. It is fascinating. So Ayn Rand is a genius on every level, but an amazing story. So Ayn Rand came to this country. She was an immigrant, came to this country, didn't really even know the language when she arrived.
From Russia,
From Russia. She was an immigrant from Tsarist Russia, from communist Russia. She came to the country to be able to be free to write, to be free. And she was a tremendous success when she got here, huge success. And her story is well documented and very well known. By the time we get to the 1940s, she had already been a very successful novelist. She had written The Fountainhead at that point. And she saw that basically the philosophical trends that she saw emerging in Europe when she left, collectivism, you are your brother's keeper.
What does that term mean exactly? I've heard that a lot.
That goes without saying now. You are your brother's keeper. That's a great example of collectivism that is just everyday. Right. I mean, maybe that's a great place for us to start. What do we talk about individualism, collectivism? I mean, collectivism is you are your brother's keeper. So, whatever happens to me is your responsibility, Michelle. So let me think of what I might do. I mean, you are your brother's keeper means that you don't own your life. Your life is not your own. That whatever happens to your brother is truly your responsibility. And in fact, your own choices are irrelevant because your brother, who's responsible for you, is going to make those choices on your behalf. So, I mean, you are your brother's keeper, and Rand talks about this as, as tremendously destructive. I mean, that's how every collectivist hellhole, every tyrannical dictator started with you saying, you are your brother's keeper. It's for the greater good, country first. These are kind of those stock collectivist slogans that amazingly don't go away. They're back again, and it's because people have really forgotten what America is all about. America is based on individualism. Individualism. So when we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's your happiness, my happiness, your individual happiness. We say it almost like by rote, oh yeah, life, liberty, but that's so unique, it's so powerful. There had never been any country, still to this day, in the world created specifically on that fundamental principle. And that's what makes America unique. That's what makes this country great.
And so she came here and she recognized that?
Yes, she came here, she had recognized that. She saw that those principles were being eroded and violated for, a lot of reasons, more than anything, the impact of progressive education in the 1920s. So she was recruited by a group of, interestingly, I mean, we're in Hollywood right now. She was recruited by really the top Hollywood stars of the day, Clark Gable and Walt Disney, and
because she was a screenwriter.
She was a screenwriter, and she, as I said, had already been a major novelist as well. So she was recruited to write for a publication that this group of individuals, this group of Hollywood stars really had put together. They called themselves the Motion Picture Association for the Preservation of American Ideals.
Wow.
And a group of concerned citizens who saw communism's encroaching, specifically actually within the film and entertainment business, and recruited Ayn Rand. And so she started what she called, if I may, Textbook of Americanism. That was her original series, was called Textbook of Americanism. She started in 1946, and she sketched out 46 questions that were going to be a layman's guide to just what's this country about? Not for highfalutin, philosophers or scholars or even news people, but just the everyday man. Just, what are the principles this country is based on? She answered 11 of them. So she got through 11 of the answers, and then she abandoned the project for really interesting reasons. Actually, the group wanted her to kind of soften down a little bit. She signed her articles that were printed in this publication. Many of the other contributors didn't even sign their names. They wanted her to soften her tone, and for that and some other really fascinating reasons, she abandoned the project. And it was kind of forgotten about. And around that time, actually, in college, when I discovered Ayn Rand, I also discovered her work. Blew me away. It was just this short, the thing about America, Michele, is that everyone loves this country. No matter what their politics are, everyone would say, I love this country and I know what it's about. I believe I know. This is what America is all about. So everyone has an opinion about America, but so few actually know its fundamental principles. Rand's piece is so effective, so compelling, like all of her writing, to really enunciate and present these basic ideas, to reassociate individualism with what America is all about. And Ayn Rand is the American philosopher. There's this terrible stereotype of Ayn Rand, Russian, she understood this country. This country is the only, she said it's the only moral country in the history of the world. Mm-hmm. Think about that. History of the world. This country says, you own your own life. You make of it what you will. You are not your brother's keeper. Tremendously powerful. So we have not completed her project. We are representing her project. No one speaks for Ayn Rand at all. But a new textbook of Americanism completes her unfinished questions. And I've recruited some of the great scholars from the Ayn Rand Institute. There's no one political associated with this at all. These are all objectivist scholars, very familiar, obviously, with Ayn Rand's work, to present what they think would be her interpretation of how she would answer those unremaining questions. So a new textbook of Americanism. It's a great basic primer, Michele, introduction for young people especially, but anyone, to what's this basically is the country about.
Yeah.
And it's about individualism, your life, your liberty, your pursuit of happiness. That's lost from today's politics.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into that. Let's jump into, first, this underlying principle of individualism versus collectivism. Can you give me some examples, some clear examples of this in our world today?
Sure. Let me think of...
Or even like I think maybe like an individualist state versus a collectivist state.
Sure. Well, Ayn Rand says an individualist... It's funny, I was asked on another program about, they said, well, I think the country is too individualist because everyone is always on his phones all the time. So there's this sense of like, oh, well, that's not what individualism doesn't mean that you're always on your phone all the time. And an individualist is... paraphrasing Rand now, essentially someone who says that my life is my own and your life is your own. And I'm here to live it and pursue my own happiness and respect your individual rights and your individual liberty to do exactly the same. The collectivism comes when you start to not just say, but sacrifice yourself, your life, your liberty for something else, whether it's the nation. That's a pretty common one right now, actually, and that's pretty surprising because most people would think, well, don't you love the country? You're a nationalist. But nationalism, as it's properly understood, is my country, right or wrong. But it's my country because of what the country is about, and America is about a person's individual right to their own life. So collectivism is almost so difficult to describe, Michele. It's just it's everywhere. It's where you look around us. I guess people's obsession with race is a really easy one right now to say, like, well, what race are they? And that, as if that defines something, as if that says what their ideas are about. So against what really American principles are all about, to look at people based on their ideas as individuals, not part of some group or tribe.
Yeah. Well, you were talking about individual rights.
Yes.
You guys talk about this a lot in the book.
Yeah.
So how does Americanism define individual rights? Would that be a good way of putting that?
Sure. I think there's a sense now, there's a sense that there's a sense that Americanism is essentially whatever we vote on. That government is majority rule. You know, that, you know, if the majority of the people voted for it, that's what it is. And in fact, one of the articles in the book written by a gentleman named Greg Salmieri talks about voting as being important about Americanism, but not the defining characteristic about Americanism. Americanism, true Americanism, is based on that principle, as you said, of individual rights. The idea, to kind of sum it up, that your life is your own. It belongs to you, that you have sovereignty over it. And those rights come not because they're given to you by a government. You know, it's pretty common these days now to hear about, well, if I can join this group, I can have new rights as a function of being part of a group. But you know, Ayn Rand and I think true Americanism would posit that rights belong to each individual because they're an individual. They're not granted by supernatural God or certainly by a government. Yeah. And that government's role, its only role, is simply to protect their right to live their own life unmolested by government. That's really radical because, as I said, in every other civilization, it was, you know, what have you done for the state? You know, what have you done for the front? You know, you're a peanut farmer, you should be growing soybeans, so move over there and do that. And we're going to point a gun at you until you did that. America said, you know, use your own mind, use your own reason, and build what you can and keep what you can. So this is like the basic ideas of individual rights. It's just completely lost right now. So
what are our rights? Because I feel like I hear that a lot. You know, like our healthcare is a right.
Yes.
So I have a right to, you know, what this and that.
Yes.
To you, what are our rights and what are not our rights?
Well, I mean, Ayn Rand's work is filled with this, even beyond Textbook of Americanism. You know, I'll sum it up briefly. I think Dr. Leonard Peikoff, his work is actually also featured in here. He was Ayn Rand's heir. His point, I think, is straight on that. You know, when we talk about a right is a right to action. You know, it's something that you can do within your own sphere and your own context. A right isn't a right to, like, a good from someone else. It's not a right to the benefit of someone else's action. So yes, within the sphere of your own world, you have the right to your own life, your own liberty, your pursuit of happiness. But when you start saying, as you know, it's pretty commonplace now to say, well, you have a right. Everyone has a right to health care, but that right means that someone else.
You're taking it.
Yeah, well, someone else has to produce that health care. Health care doesn't fall like an apple from a tree, although even an apple has to be grown, someone has to produce that apple. So a right, think about it this way, a right is a right to action. It's a right to your action within your own sphere, not to take something from someone else, to force someone to do something else on your behalf. It's a right to your own freedom, your own life.
So it's a right is the freedom to pretty much do whatever you want, in your view. Yeah. As long as you are, would it be not interfering with someone else's right to do what they want?
Yes, exactly. Rights within your individual sphere. So, you know, you have a right to trade with someone for a value. You don't have a right to demand that they give you that value. Even, I would say, and I believe a lot of our scholars in the book would say too, even if everyone votes on it. You know, Don Watkins, who's another author and a scholar in the book, has a terrific article about charity. Now, charity is, you know, if you said it was charity, is charity a right? How about that? I mean, shouldn't the government have something for poor people? Most people would say, oh yeah, come on, we have to do something. I would say that's completely un-American. You know, I could say un-American. I mean, and in fact, it's never really historically been part of the American experience and experiment. People used to say, I'd rather be dead than on the dole. But now it's just kind of seen like, well, I get my government handout, welfare, or whatever it is.
You're talking about welfare,
any element of the
safety nets.
Any element of that. Well, the irony is that the safety nets, the sad part is the safety nets don't help anyone. They're not safe. Anyone who's on the safety net, the quote safety net now, is scared to death about its ability to actually keep them safe, whether it's Social Security or Medicare, all these, you know, when you save for yourself, that's savings in your own pocket. You get to decide, right? It's your property. But Social Security isn't, or Medicare, or any of these other things. There's no lockbox with your assets in it. It's just a promise that government's going to violate someone else's rights in the future. And you know, there's a reason why none of that entitlement state, Michele, is in any of the founding documents. The founders didn't say life, liberty, property, and health care. They would have never thought about it.
Yeah, you talk about the founding fathers. So what, in this context, like, what was their original intent? You guys say it was with this individualism.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, what I comment here is I often hear that people say, well, America was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. I'll give this an example. And the point is made pretty clearly in the book that our founders were religious, but they were basically deists. So they believed in God, but God didn't interfere. God was separated from everyday life. And they believed that essentially on earth, God's work must truly be our own. And they understood that this was an opportunity for man to be free, to use his own mind, to be unmolested from government. And that's what this country, really what makes this country revolutionary, is that from, and it was always, whether it was the king, I mean, it was usually the king, right? The king owned everything. And it seems so backward to us, but my God, in Saudi Arabia, it's the same thing. It's the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So you think, like, how backward is that? The king, and so, that's what, it's still pretty novel in many ways. True capitalism, true individualism, true Americanism. So, they understood how powerful these principles were, Michele, and that was the promise of America.
So they agreed, they were on the same plane of very low government interference,
yes,
true, freedom and individualism. So
yes, I mean, the role of the founding documents limit government. They don't limit the people. They don't set well, here's what the people are allowed to do. Because government says so, and the nature of the American style of government is that the role of government is very limited. Ayn Rand writes about this, and she writes about it very effectively in Textbook of Americanism. Government's role is very specific. It's not just whatever we decide, whatever the public wants, and that's the same sense. Well, if we need roads, government can do that. If we need healthcare, government can do that. I mean, because what is government? What is it? I mean, it's right.
You tell me.
It's a gun. I mean, it sounds like, well, what are you talking about? Government is all the good things we get. Now, I mean, go back to where we started. There's two ways to do things: trade or force. So when I go to get a milkshake, I give it $4, that's trade. But when government says, we want to build a road, or we want to give someone health care, they don't ask. They come in, they point a gun at you, and you either give them it's not $4, it's more like 40% of every dollar you make. It's a lot of your life. They don't ask, they just take. So, that's the basic principle of what government is. Government is force. And I think the founders really knew that. Ayn Rand certainly understood that the necessity of limiting that force, defining that force, specifying that force, and leaving man free, because that's, where do values come from, ultimately? I mean, this Ayn Rand, we get into a little bit in the book, but Ayn Rand ultimately, I believe, is a real respect for man's reason, for man's mind, because that's where everything comes from. Do you ever look at something, Michele, and be like, my God, how did they come up with that? Like, so ingenious. Yeah. So that's the magic of man's mind. And I feel like in America, like we talk about it in the book, is capitalism efficient? Is dictatorship efficient? It sounds pretty basic, but there are people who advocate for dictatorship now, openly in this country. They might not call it, they call it national socialism. No one ever, because whatever they always say, like, oh, that wasn't real socialism, it was fake, something else.
Democratic socialism.
Yeah, this is democratic socialism. Right. So there's all these other, you're either free or you're not. It's individualism or collectivism. And it's individualism and then basically everything else.
Yeah, well, okay, so on that note about, let's say, like taxation you were talking about, you're saying the government is essentially a gun because in order to do anything or whatever they implement to get their citizens to abide by that, there has to be force, which is either by imprisonment,
it's all it can do.
Or, pretty much imprisonment.
It's all government can do, right? It is force at all.
But you brought up examples of, say, roads, infrastructure. What about things like that? I've heard some people bring up the argument of, we were talking earlier about like the big buildings that people are building and all these great things that they're innovating because of the freedom that they have.
Sure.
But then I've heard people say, well, what about the roads it takes to get those supplies?
They always use the roads.
And that.
You know, the thing is, because we had no choice in the roads. So they would say, you couldn't have built that building unless I built the roads. First of all, it's so untrue because, I mean, the best recent example is Domino's, maybe about a year ago, had an offer to start filling potholes in cities, you know, based on, the, you know, offering to do that.
Wait, tell me about that. I don't know about that.
Essentially, I'd say Google it, but this notion that only government can build roads, but private citizens can build huge skyscrapers and buildings is so unbelievable. And I'll just point to real-world examples, if nothing else, I mean, to get into a whole discussion of privatization. First of all, this country has a history of private roads, private bridges, private infrastructure, and throughout Europe, highways are privatized. Highways are privatized. Even the Chicago Skyway, which is a major highway, are privatized. So this, for some reason, this notion that, you know, government has to own all the roads, I think we have a long way to go before we get there. I mean, that's important. I think it's a relatively private, relatively minute element. But this notion that only government can build roads, and so only government can provide health care is so backward wrong. And just quickly to use your example of the buildings, I mean, you know, in America, by and large, property development is private. So the buildings go up, they're privately financed, and they're filled when they go up. They're really, very rarely are they empty. Go to China with all the government ghost cities, I'm sure you've read about those. That's what happens when government starts getting into infrastructure. You build the bridges to nowhere, and this is such a recent example in places as, you know, from the Far East to Japan historically. You know, that's what basically.
Yeah. Well, can you go a little bit more into depth on that for maybe people who don't know?
Sure. Examples of
China.
Sure. I mean, you know, what causes the road to be built? You know, before the businessman, before the entrepreneur, before capitalism, there's no reason for a road. There is no road. You know, it all starts with the capitalist, the person who's going to create the values, and that's. You know, I'll just quickly tally back, you know, to the book. Like, we still have that idea of only in America. And it is true, only in America. Why do all the exciting new companies come up in Silicon Valley, come up in America? Only in America do we still have that kind of freedom. That's why I'm not giving up this country at all. But, you know, people spend their own money wisely. They spend it to pursue their own values. They spend it for their own selfish economic pleasure. Government spends money for political reasons. It spends money because it has to make jobs. We hear that a lot these days. That used to be kind of on the left. Now it's very much on the right as well.
How do you think?
Well, that's what, you know, we're going to have Republicans who are going to be endorsing infrastructure spending as a means of creating jobs. So it's a means of, you know, taking money from people who've earned it and giving it to people for projects that maybe would get built, maybe wouldn't get built. I promise you would get built in much more efficient fashion and ultimately long-term beneficially fashion. But, you know, it kind of goes back to, you know, what we said just a moment ago, that, you know, well, is just government something that could do whatever it's want? I mean, my God, Elon Musk is sending people into space privately. Don't tell me that he can't build a road. It's like bizarre. Only government can build a road. Oh, but these few guys can build rocket ships to the moon, but they can't handle roads? Of course they can handle roads. So, yeah, I mean, government is a very important, very vital role. In fact, actually in the book as well, Alain Journo, who we both know, has been a guest on your show, very interesting guest, has a fascinating chapter on foreign policy. That's the role of government. Michele, I can't get a tank. I can't go fight Islamists in the Middle East or wherever. I can't go pursue criminals and shake them down. Or if someone comes and burglars my home, I can't get a gang together and say, all right, well, let's go find them guys and string up. No, we need government. So oftentimes people say, oh, you're into Ayn Rand, so you just think no government, no government. Ayn Rand understood, very importantly, the role of government, the essential role of government. We should be thankful we have government, but not any government, this government. I don't mean the Trump administration, of course. I mean the American style of government. You know, that's as I said, you know, the American principle of individualism. There's the point made in the book. I love this, that, you know, you go shopping, go to a mall, and you go in, you buy merchandise, you come out, and how do you know that you're not going to get ransacked? That, like, the mob's not going to turn on you. She bought something, grab it. How do you know that that's not going to happen? Well, it's because we understand we live in a civil society where people's property rights are protected. And go to Venezuela. That happens all the time now. There's just rampant crime. There's no respect for anyone's rights, basic rights. It starts very slowly, but it starts with those basic questions we talked about, that, you have a right to your own life. I write actually in the book about the estate tax. That's a pretty big one now. People say, oh, Mark Zuckerberg, why does he need to have such a big company? Why does he need to have so much influence? Why does he need to have so much money? Wouldn't we all be better off if we just separated his company, separated some of his money? It's not ours. There is no us. It's his. It's his. And the basic respect of that, loss of respect of property. And that's, it's like slavery and individual rights. You said before, talk to me, like, define individual rights. Well, if you work at a job, people say, like, oh, my boss is such a slave driver. But we all know you can tell your boss to stuff it, walk out, go find another job. Slave can't do that.
Right. There's a level of consent there.
There's every level of consent. In fact, one of the things I talk about in the book is something as benign as the minimum wage. We'd think, like, oh, we really do need a minimum wage. This is that. It's not even nanny state. It's destructive. The minimum wage is destructive specifically to young, unemployed, unskilled people. Those people who are just getting started, just want to get that first job. I worked at Starbucks. I told you that story. Something tells me you probably did something. Right? We all did. We worked that first entry-level job to get us the skills to move up the ladder. But minimum wage is it's discrimination against that. It says, unless I can hire you for $15 an hour, I can't hire you at all. Some jobs are not worth it.
Yeah,
They're not $15 an hour.
Sure. So because we've actually had people on to make the case for minimum wage. What is your case against it? Obviously, this one.
Well, more than anything, to go back to what you said, this is voluntary consent. This is Americanism. You own your life, and if you want to go work a job for $3 or $4 or $5 or no dollars. I worked jobs for low money. I also interned.
I did internships for free.
And those are pretty valuable to you, my guess is.
It turned into a job.
Turned into a job, exactly. So, there's so many stories of that. Steve Jobs going and working for Bill Hewlett, I believe. I'm probably massacring. I know you have Apple fans. Did he have to get official paperwork? A job is a mutually beneficial relationship. So for the government to come in and say, like, no, we've got to be part of this. We've got to make sure that you get this and you get that. It's such an insult to anyone who'd say, like, wait, I want to take this job. He's offering this opportunity. I want to take it. Or the person who wants to hire them and say, like, no, I want to hire this individual. So government has no role in deciding what choices I make with my life, who I hire, where I work, how much I work for. That's what an insult to anyone on both sides of the trade.
What do you think about the argument of workers being exploited? The potential for that, if there's no one fighting for them, that they're gonna have to work 50 hours a week, or 50, we'll say like 100 hours a week for $2 an hour, and they have families or whatever. Like, what do you think about?
Well, I would say this.
No protection.
I believe that you're going to have to work in America. That is one of the beautiful things about America, is that nothing is guaranteed. You have no right to a job, right to an income. That's the exciting thing about America, is that you are free. So I think there is this sense, unfortunately, and I don't, it's been taught for a lot of time, for many, many years, that people grow up with that sense of, like, well, I'm entitled to some basic living. You're entitled to what values you can create and you can produce. And what inevitably ends up happening is that most people get those skills, build those skills, create those opportunities. And if someone can't take care of himself, if someone makes terrible choices in their life, this is me speaking now, certainly not Ayn Rand, but I believe if someone has a dozen kids that they can't take care of, they make terrible choices, they don't get educated at all in any skill, I'm not just talking about higher education, they don't better themselves in any way, they're the ones who should be most for capitalism, because they're the ones who need charity. They're the ones, they can't expect anyone else to be obligated to provide for them.
So then that would imply that capitalism helps charity?
Capitalism helps everybody. Where do you want to be? Where do you want to be poor? Let's put it this way. First of all, this idea of there has to be the poor is such BS. the poor is, it's a, I don't believe in it. I don't believe in it. Actually, I think it's a rather collectivist idea.
The poor.
Yeah. I think it's, Americanism, when we started talking about America, is about individuals. Individual people making their own choices. And you know what? People who are part of the poor, a lot of them aren't the poor for very long. They pull themselves out. I mean, I don't have the stories. There's ad infinitum. We could go on and on about people who've pulled themselves out of terrible situations to become huge successes. That is the American dream. It's not dead by any means.
Do you think, let's just go ahead and jump into to economics and capitalism, because you hear right now that capitalism has a lot to do with the wealth gap. What do you think about that?
Yaron Brook and Don Watkins actually have a book on this exact topic of why equal is unfair is the name of the book. So, the wealth gap is, I think it's actually kind of an un-American idea, if I can say that. People who are, how do you become a billionaire? How do people who are very wealthy become wealthy? Did they get it by exploiting the poor? It's not like, did Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, did they exploit the poor? They get it by creating something of value, producing something of value that helps billions and billions of people every day. I give the example these days, Michelle, that, I remember my folks bought an encyclopedia in the 80s that was $1,500 in the 80s. That's like $3 or $4 grand today.
That's how much encyclopedias
were?
Oh
yeah, they were tremendously expensive. You think about too, that was books one time a year updated. It wasn't exactly. So knowledge was so along. How do you get to be rich in America? How do you get to be up there at the top by creating something of value, producing something of value? And the gap really is irrelevant as long as people are free. This is not a country where anyone is guaranteed anything. Only the opportunity to go as high and as far as they can take themselves. That's a beautiful thing. And as we kind of said a moment ago, it's not ironic, but it's benevolent that the poor in, let's say, the lowest end of the gap, right? If there's this gap, the gap to me is irrelevant, but the people in the lowest end of the gap in America are tremendously wealthy by every stretch of the imagination on a world stage. Where else would you rather be poor than in America? And not because of the freebies, the handouts, the
welfare.
The welfare state, exactly.
You guys have a question in the book called, "Is capitalism efficient?"
Yes. Well, there's, Ayn Rand has a great book actually called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So capitalism is pretty unknown even as to what it is. Capitalism is the American system, and this country is a capitalist country. We haven't acted like it, certainly not.
I was going to say, do you think we're capitalist?
No, terrible. It's been happening it's getting worse and worse and worse. Capitalism, think of it as leaving people free to trade for their own selfish benefit. Where do we start talking about two ways to interact, trade and force. When you leave people free to trade to their own selfish benefit, I'm not religious, but it is like a miracle. In a capitalist country, it's like it used to be maybe every year, but like every 6 months, there's tremendous new miracles, innovations in healthcare and technology and building. Capitalism it's tremendously efficient. And in fact, if you look at the lifespan, this is, it's not in the book, but it's well-documented fact. If you look at people's lifespans throughout history, it was kind of flatlined. People lived to be 18, 20, 25 years old for most of mankind's life up until, what? The Industrial Revolution. Beginnings of capitalism, trade, at first in Europe and in England, and then ultimately here in America. That's when life expectancy really started to shoot up. And so capitalism is, and that's why people still are getting in dingy little yachts. They wish. They're getting in squalid little boats in Cuba. They're getting in caravans in the middle of Ecuador, El Salvador, these terrible places, to come up here and work very awful jobs, to pursue their American dream. And we should welcome that. We should welcome that. That's the real promise of America.
Because that does bring up a good question is, I guess, why are so many people trying to come here?
I would never propose to, I believe because despite everything that's going on with our own politics, this country still represents, opportunity writ large. Opportunity to worship, if you're into the type of thing. Opportunity to pursue wealth, which hopefully everyone should be into. What do we often hear now? Well, they're taking our jobs, they're taking our wealth. That's exactly the wrong way to look at it.
Immigrants.
Immigrants, exactly. I mean, it's a very un-American perspective to look at it as well. I mean, the more people who are here. I mean, would any of us be better off on a desert island where no one ever came? When no one ever came, new people come, they bring new skills, they bring new hands, they bring new minds, they bring new abilities. I mean, it's not surprising that so much of the Fortune 500, certainly in Silicon Valley, are from second and third generation entrepreneurs. One of the things I love, Michele, that I get so emotional about this country is that you can come here and become American. It's like I have so many friends who either they came from India or whatever, it's like they came from somewhere, or they came from Canada, but they're American, not because of their bloodline, their color. I mean, that's that racist, collectivist bullshit that really frustrates me. I'm part of this tribe, that tribe. This is the only country in the history of the world, I think to this day, you can go and really become American. Move to France, I'm never going to be French. Never. I could live there for 30 years. They'd say, he's from America, he's just living here in France. Mm-hmm. People come here and they become American not because of the color of their skin, but they embrace these values, individualism, capitalism, working hard and starting at, oftentimes the immigrants are the ones who have the best sense of Americanism. They're coming there to pursue their own dream. They're the ones who are most excited about it. They need the education, but our own people need it as well.
How does Ayn Rand's philosophy fall with immigration, like actual border patrol or control? What did she think about that, or how hard or easy it is for people to become citizens or get their green cards?
This is probably the best example of, objectivism is a philosophy. There's a lot of different opinions on that very issue, and it's a hotly debated issue in objectivism and out of objectivism. Some people are very much in favor of every phrase has kind of a hot button take, but let's just say open. Well, let's say open borders. Others are.
Would you say that you guys are open border?
No, well, I would never say you guys. Come on now.
You got okay. Ayn Rand philosophy.
No, I mean, well, even within objectivism, some people are more. Some people are more advocate for more open immigration. Mm-hmm. Others are much more restrictive based on a lot of different reasons.
So there's a range.
Of course. That's what makes the discussion of Americanism and ideas so interesting, is that there is great debates about it, especially when it comes down to individual application. So yes, you can debate about, should we have minimal screening at the border? Should we have heavy screening at the border? But I think the value of immigrants to the country, I don't think is really debated amongst anyone, that what they do bring to the country. And so I think for me, that's not really up for debate.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Well, okay, so we talked about democracy. Let's talk about socialist states. I asked you one of the questions in the book is capitalism efficient? Yes. Another question was, are socialist states efficient?
Yeah, I mean, socialism, it's so funny now because especially for young people, it's got such great PR, which is funny because why would it? Every example of socialism you see, let's finish my sentence, is true. So capitalism gets a bad rap because it's selfish. Capitalism is about you, as we talked about trade. And when you trade and a capitalist makes a trade for their own benefit. So socialism is so much more, it's seen as benevolent. Oh, you're a socialist, you care about other people. If you care about other people, you should be for capitalism. I mean, what other system is everyone better off and under capitalism? But socialism, it's appealing, I think, especially to young people because they've been taught since day one that you have to sacrifice. You're here to sacrifice for the greater good. You asked before about you are your brother's keeper. I mean, that's socialism. You are your brother's keeper. So hey, some people have bad conditions, healthcare conditions, and we all are going to need healthcare. So if we all just get together, we can make sure that everyone is taken care of.
Well, let's talk about
and what ends up happening, of course, is that no one's taken care of.
Is that what happens with, so specifically the healthcare example, you hear a lot of people praise, say, the Nordic countries and their system of universal healthcare. Why do you think that that's bad? What are they doing wrong there?
Well, I'm not an expert on that healthcare system or, the Nordic countries specifically, but, my understanding is that a lot of Nordic countries are held out as this example of successful socialism. Yeah. Well, see, socialism works. Look at Norway, look at Sweden. Those are really more mixed economies. There's elements of socialism and there's lots of elements of economic freedom as well. And when you even think about it, you could say the same thing here. I mean, even before Obamacare, now we're going back 10 years, government paid for half of all health care in this country. It's more even now with the advent of Obamacare. So, we don't have a socialist healthcare country now, or we don't have a socialist healthcare system, but we have a system that specifically, no one can be refused healthcare for a pre-existing condition. So, the basic premise, the basic principle is there. I mean, in a capitalist society, and it sounds so fantastic now, but it's how this country was, really up until the advent of Medicare and Medicaid and government's real intrusion into healthcare. I mean, healthcare in this country, by and large, was better, in my belief, across the board, certainly more cost-effective to everyone before government started getting involved with healthcare. And more, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, everywhere government gets involved, beyond its proper scope, keeping us free.
Yeah.
You're going to see Ayn Rand, or I won't say, people shouldn't be complaining about the cost of the police. I'm not saying that there's not waste in police, there's not a problem with police, but police is the role of government. Keep me free, keep us free. But when it comes to healthcare, that's everyone's individual responsibility and right to choose for themselves.
Yeah. Can you jump into why you think that is with whether it's education or healthcare, that the intervention of government makes it worse? Because in case anyone's watching that is a proponent of free college or free healthcare.
It's a deceptively simple question. Well, it's wrong in every way. How about that one? I mean, it's wrong in every way. One of the things Ayn Rand always talks about is that there's no difference between what's practical and what's moral. What's right is also what works. We know that capitalism works, and we know that socialism is wrong, and it's especially true when it comes to something like higher education. The reason education is so expensive, the best example.
Yeah, because it's getting more and more expensive.
And the more and more government has gotten involved with it. I mean, there's been books and books written about this, about how government loans subsidize inefficiency, push up the cost of education. We've seen the same thing in healthcare now as well. It's why that if you pay the list price for any drug, it's always enormous. Why? Because healthcare providers know that there's a government subsidized payer there, Medicare, Medicaid, so the markets are distorted. It happens every time government gets involved in any market. And it gets back to kind of what we talked about before, because, what is a market? What is healthcare? Healthcare ultimately comes down to us as individuals and a healthcare providers coming down and making a trade. Government starts to get involved in that and says, no, wait a minute. We're going to make the decisions here. Well, if it's going to be free education, we have to decide, well, what kind of education is it? Who should get it? How long is it? What type of topics should be discussed? And it's going to make those decisions for political purposes, not for any individual's purposes.
Have you heard?
And that's wrong. It's wrong. Oh, and I'll say one more thing if I could too. I mean, when we talk about liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, liberty is liberty from others. So everyone says, oh, it'd be great if I had a free education, but it's not anyone's responsibility to provide you for an education. And you know what? If you can't afford to educate your kids, you shouldn't have them. This is my opinion. Americanism, I think, is that understanding of self-reliance, self-responsibility. Doesn't mean you don't accept help from others or that you don't help others. But it's an understanding that that's not government's role, is to give you anything, just to leave you free.
Have you heard, on the healthcare thing, have you heard of the LASIK eye surgery and cosmetic surgery examples?
Of course.
Because I've heard that, and I thought that was a kind of interesting point, which is...
Yeah, right. I mean, LASIK, this is exactly right. It's such a great real-world example. But it's like we don't need them. Look at North and South Korea. There's your friggin' real-world example. I mean, Socialism versus capitalism, we see it time and time again. And LASIK is a great example. LASIK eye surgery, I think this is where you're going, generally not covered by any government health care. It's not covered by, it's not subsidized by government. Quality's gone up, price has gone down. Anyone can afford LASIK. It's almost like a cell phone now. When cell phones first came out, very expensive. Anyone can basically afford a cell phone now. They can get a disposable cell phone. So you see that time and time again, when government stays out of private relationships, stays out of markets, prices go down, quality goes up. In fact, there's even, these guys have all been made to be demons over the years. And everyone from Andrew Carnegie, Bill Gates, these are the monopolists. Names are escaping me now, but Sam Walton, of course, with Walmart, monopolists. Monopolists are monopolists by our choice, our public choice, our individual choice.
Because we're shopping there. We're the ones giving them
Amazon
money.
is the best one now. Like Amazon now, for some reason, is public enemy number one. But when you ask anyone, they'd say, "Oh, I do love Amazon," and everyone loves Amazon, and they should love Amazon. I mean, what an unbelievable, magnificent creation it is! Not just to what you can get, but what you can sell. I mean, Amazon lets anyone be a screenwriter, lets anyone be a book publisher, lets anyone pursue their. I mean, this is something that is so unbelievable novel. And what's Jeff Bezos' thanks? He's getting basically threatened by the president to be broken up. And he gets ridiculed for having too much information and controlling too much of the market. I mean, these are great heroes.
What are their suggestions for that? If they think it's a problem, what are they suggesting to fix it?
Well, they're gonna pursue antitrust. So antitrust sounds so benign. Antitrust. Government's going to come in and break up companies. They've done this time and time again, or threatened to break up companies. And it sounds kind of out there. What does this have to do with me? I just go back to this idea of think about the products you use every day. Microsoft, Facebook, these, it's only by these individuals' freedom. Microsoft isn't just a entity. It's individuals who are there pursuing technology, pursuing innovation to bring us something that we can enjoy and love. The more government gets involved with that, the more difficult it is for them to achieve it.
Do you believe in any regulation at all?
Well, no. The answer is no. I don't believe in any regulation at all. If you protect individual rights, I mean, that is essentially what you would think of as being regulation. So, kind of a classic example is, the classic example, I just heard this on Fox the other day of if we didn't regulate air travel, then planes would be falling out of the sky. And this was from a supposedly conservative TV host. Think about what regulation has done to air travel. It's made it, airlines are supposedly unregulated, but every element of it's regulated, from how many seats can be in a row to how many airports and so in a free market, it's in every individual trader's self-interest to have a happy customer, if you will. So it's no one's self-interest to poison their customer, to kill their customer. But regulation, a great example, not just LASIK, but a great example is aspirin. Aspirin is available over the counter. If it had been grandfathered in because it was invented so long ago, you wonder. It's so aspirin is dirt cheap, so powerful. How many billions of dollars would that take in FDA approval to actually make it to our doors now?
When you say grandfathered in,
before the FDA. Before the FDA, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, before the FDA, did people thrive by killing their customers? No, by selling. And if you're foolish enough to take a pill from anyone who offers it, I think you get what you deserve. Yeah. But no, in a free market, you wouldn't need any regulation. And in fact, regulation does tremendous harm. You don't think about a bank now when you go to a bank because you think, it's regulated. So there's no sense of, oftentimes what regulation does is it disguises the problems, because in a free market, you'd have someone saying, wait a minute, that bank doesn't have the money they need to cover those loans or to pay back their depositors. So no, regulation actually hurts markets.
I know this is a really specific example, but speaking of drugs, what do you remember the story of that guy? I think this was a couple years ago. He bought a drug, or like bought whatever the company that made the drug or something.
Oh, Martin Shkreli.
And I think it was maybe a cancer drug or something that helped cancer patients, and just shot up the price an astronomical amount.
Yes.
What about an example like that?
I can't speak to that because
I know it's so.
Well, it's a pretty niche. I wish I was better well versed in that, but I'll just say healthcare is just a textbook example of price inflation specifically as a result of government intervention. When you know there's someone there to pick up the tab, you know government's going to pick up the tab, you have every incentive to keep prices as high as possible. So I can't speak to it specifically, but what our frustration should be when people point to something like high prices in drugs and say, see, capitalism doesn't work. See, the markets are broken. I hear it in finance all the time. I mean, why did the economy crash in 2008? They'd say, well, because see, capitalism doesn't work. But that certainly wasn't free markets in healthcare now or then, or in banking or finance then. So inevitably, where you see crisis, where you see price inflation, when you see bad outcomes, are places in when government has a very, very heavy hand, just like medicine.
How did they in that specific case? In the last crash?
Oh, in the financial crash?
Yeah.
I mean, every element of the finance coming into the crash of 2008 was one of the most highly regulated businesses and influenced businesses. I mean, go back to everything from the liar loans, that they were called liar loans, but the no-doc loans that were incentivized for people to get into those first starter homes, to interest rates, of course, which are artificially minimized, to the whole government created entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These are government-sponsored entities that were basically allowed to borrow money with the implicit promise that government's going to pay it back, and that's exactly what they did. So, yeah, I mean, government is tremendously invested in finance, regulated in finance, and it's what I believe led to the crash, and I think it's what has really hindered a lot of potential growth in the years since.
Because you don't believe in bailouts either.
Oh, God, no. Of course not.
Because you say that's another form of charity, right?
It's another. I mean, a bailout is a terrible violation of your rights. I mean, think about that. Like you never bought. You paid off your mortgage. You didn't buy a home you couldn't afford. You didn't invest and make risky investments. You didn't. And then these people do, and then along comes government and says, oh, we really got to help them out. So we're going to take what you created, what you saved.
With tax money, which is essentially our money, and give it to them.
What could be more completely offensive than that? And but there's this mythology that, well, if we don't have a bailout, then it's going to be some apocalyptic. The ATMs won't work. Companies go bankrupt all the time. In a capitalist society, it's actually okay. What ends up happening is that the debtors, the creditors lose their money. People lose money all the time. I'm in investments. You lose money all the time, but you do it voluntarily. When I invest in a company and goes bankrupt, I do it voluntarily. But when you are not asked, but when you're forced to bail out a bankrupt company, that's the gun. That's government gun. That's what could be more immoral.
Yeah. There was a phrase in the book called production for use and not production for profit. Can you explain that?
I mean, it comes back to the accusation of socialists that essentially profit is exploitation of the workers, that any profit is money that's really owed to the workers. So, any surplus should go to the workers, should be used by the workers. So what's the really value of profit? And you hear that oftentimes these days when it comes to people who make a lot of money. So, well, wouldn't that be better if it was spent? Wouldn't that be better if But when people earn money, what happens to it? That profit is invested. They don't bury it in the ground. People earn money in a capitalist and a free economy. That money is invested into new production. So there's this false dichotomy of like, well, if it's profit, then it's waste. Profit is the sign of production. Profit is what production really is. Without profit, there is no production. And it's a virtuous circle. I mean, there's this fixed pie mentality now, I think, certainly socialists, but even this nationalist branch in politics now that says, well, there's only a certain number of jobs, there's only a certain number of wealth, so it's going to be these ones or that ones or immigrants. it's an unlimited. There's an unlimited amount of wealth for all of us. So there's not this dichotomy of, well, should the money be for profit or should it be for the workers? It's for anyone who earns it. And the profit is earned by the owners of businesses, and it's invested into new production, new jobs. And it's a tremendously virtuous cycle, and that's the story of America.
And communism would essentially be the opposite, is that right? Communism the state owns the production.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. I mean, communism, a lot of these words are kind of, terms are thrown out pretty casually now, I think. Communism is this and socialism is that. I mean, the big categories you should know is that essentially it's individualism and everything else. Socialism, communism, fascism, nationalism, these are all forms of collectivism because they're all forms of sacrificing yourself to the group, being part of a group, whether it's the National Soviet States or the Cuban government, the Cuban people. America solely said that you own your own life, you have a right to your own life. So as you said, a traditional hallmark of communist societies is that the means of production, companies are owned by government and owned by the state. Still, even to this day, a lot of, they're all almost inevitably bankrupt or on their way to being bankrupt. I happen to think that's going to be the next big story out of China, if you will. China's, this isn't in the book, but, China's power, any power China has gained on the world stage has come as they've freed their economy, not as they've made it more economically communist. So, but ultimately, whether it's communism where the government owns the means of production, or nationalism, or fascism, which is what I actually think we're in now, is that sure, property is privately owned, but government is going to tell you exactly how to use it. Government's going to tell you what to produce and how to produce and where to buy and where the planes can fly and where new airports can be built. I'm using just a few of our recent examples. So.
Well, there's another question in there. What is the difference between communism and fascism?
Yeah, I think that is probably that's the clearest kind of answer is that communism, the means of production are owned by the government, owned by the states. Fascism, yeah, they're privately owned, but it's really controlled ultimately by the government, by regulation. And that's just as dangerous.
Why do you think right now we're at risk of becoming leaning towards fascism?
Well, it's funny. Communism has been so humiliated over and over and over again that you don't see any people really campaigning pro-communism. Even Bernie Sanders, who's really kind of I give Bernie a tremendous amount of credit for being philosophically consistent. You know what he stands for, which I really respect. I don't respect his politics at all, obviously. I think fascism is almost like a more deceptive, I think, form of collectivism. Because it says, oh, no, private property is privately owned. You have your own business, but government's going to tell you exactly, well, first of all, these days it's like which businesses should fail and which businesses should succeed. Under Obama, I'm an investment guy, so under Obama, it was the oil companies and the hedge funds. We don't need those. We have to help the teachers, we have to help the steel workers. For Trump, it's going to be farmers or it's going to be whoever his favored groups are. This is so contrary to Americanism. There's no, Americanism says, no one gets favors from the government. No one gets freebies from anyone else. There's not free, of course. No one gets subsidies. No one gets that. It's not government's role at all. People are left free. So, and out of the economy. Just as there's a separation of church and state, there has to be a separation of the economy and the state as well. In a true capitalist laissez-faire economy, which is what America really is.
There's another phrase in the book called the greatest, what is it? The greatest...
the greatest good for the greatest number?
Greatest number, yes.
Yeah,
Is that pretty much in the same vein?
Yeah, it's, collectivists have all these little tricks to kind of, hook you in. They'd say, oh, well, you are your brother's keeper. Oh, yeah, I heard that in church for a long time. I guess my brother's keeper. Or they'll say, hey, we have to do the greatest good for the greatest number. It's the story of Socrates, right? the greatest good for the greatest number is they killed Socrates. But America isn't about majority rule. It's not about the greatest good for the greatest. It's about the greatest good for each individual. Every individual owns his own life. And, it's not a question of counting of noses. Your rights in America don't define on, well, Is everyone in a good mood today, or do they want to vote to gang up on me and make me walk the plank? So all these little catchphrases, these little slogans that I think collectivists use. You mentioned one of them. I think the candidate on social media I saw, the guy from Florida said, it's all about the collective. Hey, we're all in it together.
And that was so funny because I was reading this book because the midterm elections were yesterday.
Yeah.
And I was, preparing for this, and I was reading the book and all that, and I went on Twitter, and that was the exact line, was in his concession speech. It was like blah blah blah, and then the line was, "It's all about the collective." And I thought it was such an interesting, blatant statement. And reading a book about individualism, I think I commented.
And no one says anything because it's very like, oh yeah, it is all about the collective. But don't be mistaken. When people hear, well, I'm an individualist, what do they say? Oh, well, you don't work with anyone else? You don't want to be with anyone else? You just want to live on an island by yourself? And it's like I wish I could sometimes debate. That's why I think, debate real arguments as against a straw man, because of course that's a terrific straw man. I mean, individualists work with people all the time. That's how every individual succeeds, Michele, is by working with others. By trading with, exactly, and doing it for their own selfish benefit, doing it for themselves. So to be an individualist doesn't mean not to care about other people, not to work with other people, to collaborate with other people, but to do it freely and to do it based on your own voluntary choice and not because government points to you and says, hey, you, go there and do that.
Well, to say that decisions for society shouldn't be made just by the majority, that raises the question, is America a democracy?
Well, America is a constitutional republic. It is not a democracy. And it's, terrific essay actually in the new Textbook of Americanism on this exact point. When people talk about, well, what's America really about? Maybe you'll get like, well, it's about the Constitution, some if we're lucky. Others will say it's about kneeling or apple pie or anything else, something McDonald's. Maybe they might say, as you said, well, America's about democracy, but it's actually not. Specifically, democracy means majority rule. That is not what America is about at all. That's one of the benefits of America, and one of the great achievements of America is that this is the country that said it's not majority rule, that you have a right to your own life, liberty, pursuit of happiness that's not up to the whim of a vote. So no, I mean, even when we go to vote, Michele, I would be very, what's so frustrating now is this notion of not, we vote for who's going to rule us, not a real more important of why do we need to be ruled, or should we be ruled, or what's the right type of government, not, who needs to make decisions on our behalf.
We were talking about this because I asked you before while we were still setting up, I was like, are you happy with the election results and this and that? And you said you were indifferent, if you don't mind my saying your answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, we need, people say, well, this start, if you want change in this country, it does not happen at the ballot box. There's a great line, Ayn Rand has a great line actually, where she says that elections happen every month of the year except for November. Meaning that the real change doesn't happen in Washington. It doesn't happen in politics. It happens basically in college. It happens with young people. Because who is advising the politicians? Who's electing the politicians? The people who've integrated these basic ideas, who brought up always believing that I am my brother's keeper. And that's why, and I got a sidetrack, but why even the Republicans, the so-called defenders of free markets, are so against free markets. They grew up with, I believe in capitalism, but hey, this person needs health care, this person needs a job, and I am my brother's keeper. So true Americanism rejects all that whole cloth, and it starts with that education. And as I said, politics, it's too late. It doesn't change with politics. We're only going to elect people with the right ideas if we have the right ideas as a population. So we have a lot of education to do because people don't even know what the country's about. Haven't thought about it, haven't been asked to think about it.
So what is a constitutional republic? How is that different than a democracy that a lot of people think America is?
I would leave that question to a scholar, to a constitutional scholar, which I certainly am not. But America is unique in that it's not a majority vote. Everything isn't up for grabs in America, that you have inalienable rights, as was defined by the founders: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And these aren't up for a vote. It was a really novel thing, still is a really novel thing in the history of the world. So, it's not just a question of, if I can get the votes, I can push it through. But that's a lot of what American politics have become, and that's too bad. And that's why I think the book is so important.
I don't know if this was just something specific to the book, or if, this is said elsewhere too, but in regards to the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, in the book I was reading it as life, liberty, property, and pursuit of happiness.
Yes.
So I don't know, is that specific to the book, or is
No, I believe that was actually initially in those founding
really?
words.
And it was
Property
taken
was
out?
included. I believe it is. It's explained in more detail in the book, but yes, property wasn't included, and it makes sense because if you have the right to earn property, if you can't keep it, it's the idea of earning property and then keeping your own property, having the right to it, having the right to own it, to preserve it. That's really unique to America as well. So yes, property is a very important, and Ayn Rand is a wonderful quote, and one of her kind of great tenets is that, without property rights, no other rights are possible. So property rights are so integral, I believe, to what Americanism is, starting with your own body. Who owns you? Who do you belong to? Do you belong to your neighbor, to your point? Is your neighbor the country, the greater good? No, you are your own sovereign entity. And that's a pretty unique, radical idea.
So what does that mean exactly? Because I imagine it doesn't mean everyone has a right to be given a home.
Sure.
Or, be given property. So what does that mean exactly?
When you say right to property?
Yeah.
The right to earn and keep property, absolutely. When people say, well, the right to property, it's not the right, as you said, to a home, to any good from someone else, but the right to earn it, the right to go out and to trade with others, to their benefit and to your own, based on your own skills and your own ability, and to keep the achievements that you've earned. And actually, Michele, too, to feel good about it. Oftentimes even the greatest capitalists, say, well, I mean, Bill Gates is the greatest example. When he made a lot of money with Microsoft, he was kind of a villain, monopolist. But when he started giving all the money away, oh, Bill Gates is a good guy.
He's a philanthropist,
Yeah, it's like only when you give money away for some reason in America these days, but we should be applauding people who earn it and create it and keep it for their own selfish benefit. That's a big part of it as well. If you earn money but you're only considered moral and virtuous when you start giving it away, then that's I feel sorry for the people who feel like that's important. I mean, what made Bill Gates great isn't that he gave away billions of dollars, but that he created Microsoft, and every day we should be thanking him. So I respect that right, but he's like the president, he's a great example of successful business person who's not a great spokesman or advocate for capitalism.
Do you know who Ben Shapiro is?
Sure.
So he made a comparison once of, it was probably Steve Jobs, not Bill Gates, but it was probably the same. He was saying that, in his opinion, as much as he admires Mother Teresa, he said he actually thinks Steve Jobs did more for poor people than Mother Teresa did.
Are you kidding? I mean, come on. It's not even...
Hearing that was kind of... I mean, your first reaction is like...
Well, Mother Teresa's... Mother Teresa is... Actually, I got booze at Hillside College. Hillsdale? Whatever the free market college is now. I got booze there because I said exactly that years ago.
Oh,
right?
really?
Yeah, because Mother Teresa's held up as that example of, we could all be like Mother Teresa because your life is better... wiping people's feet, giving up every value, living in squalor amongst the who that certainly doesn't help anyone. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, these people have bettered our own lives. They've created the wealth that helps people get up out of the squalor, that helps people become better persons and improve their own lives. So yeah, I mean the fact that Mother Teresa is always held up as this great example. And as I understand, I haven't read her biography, but as I understand it, she was a very unhappy person. She's a very, very unhappy person. And I'm not surprised. When you live in these collectivist societies, and collectivists, I think, there's always like a little bit of grumbling. Oh yeah, I am my brother's keeper. But geez, this guy keeps smoking, and this person keeps not taking care of themselves. And God, I want to live my own life. And that's that American spirit in there, a little bit, that selfish American spirit that says, my God, I'm 20 years old, 25 years old, if I'm lucky, I have 30 more years, 40 more years. I'm not going to waste a second of it. That I don't owe it to government. I don't owe it to the public, to society. That's one of the great things about America is that, you're not born with this debt. Well, I'm 13 now, I've got to pay it off. No, you're free. So exciting, so revolutionary, even now.
You've said that you think that neither Republicans nor Democrats reflect true Americanism.
Yes.
Why do you say that?
Well, in what they do and what they say. I mean, the Democrats have been proudly collectivists that's kind of part of what they are. I mean, the Democrats really embrace racial politics, I think sexism in obvious ways. As I read about a bill, I believe, that was passed here in California requiring that companies have a female board member.
Did that pass?
Even if it was proposed, doesn't matter if it passed or not. I mean, like, what an unbelievable, I mean, so it's for I think many on the so-called left, it's always a bit about seeing you as what part of group or tribe you're part of. I mean, Americanism, true Americanism says that, whether you're transgender, man, black, this, whatever it is, every person is an individual who has the same rights. The so-called right, I believe, now has become equally as collectivist. And it's an embrace of religion. It's an embrace of nationalism. My country, as I said, right or wrong. And, they have used that philosophy to embrace, tariffs are probably the best example. They want to make you feel bad. Well, not just feel bad, but they believe that for some reason, if you buy a Toblerone and not a Hershey, you're hurting America. If you buy a foreign, car, well, how could you do that? You owe it to the country. America first. America isn't about America first. It's about your life. And if you always wanted a BMW, you worked your whole life to finally make the money, and now, along comes the government and says, well, you need to help the country. Bullshit. America is about pursuing what you want, trading to get what you want. And the GOP now is just as nationalist, just as ugly, and just as collectivist. That's what I think makes the book so important, is that we need a refresher that America is about the individual, his own liberty, his own individuality, and his own pursuit of happiness.
Do you think, that this is a question in the book, do you think that Americans or people in general should reject the idea of a universal government?
Yes, yeah, yes, Rand. Actually, I should point out one of the most exciting things about the book is that thanks to the Ayn Rand Institute, there's a tremendous amount of unpublished material from Ayn Rand specifically that's now only available for the first time. This is one of the questions that she was asked, should you believe in a world government? And actually, those of us who believe in trade, we're often accused these days of being globalists. It's one world government. It's just kind of another baseless straw man. But Rand was very much against the idea of a world government. She talked about it as essentially as checks and balances, that if something goes wrong in one country, we are men, none of us are there's no omnipotence, we're mortal. So if something goes wrong in one country, you can flee to another. And that's, I think, a pretty realistic idea, because frankly, we can see, time and time again, Venezuela is probably the best example. This was the breadbasket of South America. And now it's really become like a living war zone, not because of a war, but because of government and because of collectivism.
Yeah. What exactly happened in Venezuela? I know it's a socialist country, and I hear the horrific stories of people finding rats and eating rats because they literally can't get food elsewhere. How did that go far so quickly?
Well, people eating zoo animals is the inevitable result of socialism. Anywhere it's practiced, to the extent that it's practiced, that's always what ends up happening. Venezuela used to be tremendously, not free, but semi-free, a mixed economy, and a tremendously productive, prosperous. You know how much oil they sit on. Hugo Chavez was elected in the late 90s with a promise of, he called it 21st century socialism. This isn't my words. This was kind of, he was running on, this is going to be 21st century socialism. And now, 17 years later, you see where that has gotten us. And it started with everything from, speaking of property, taking private landowners' property.
The government.
Yeah, sure. Government confiscating private landowners' property, government confiscating people's businesses. Surprise, surprise, everyone starts leaving. The smart ones start leaving. Government starts regulating more and more of the economy. And, here's what you get. You get country that's sitting on all this oil wealth with no one to work the machines, understand the machines, produce from the machines, and inflation at, on my website, capitalismpig.com, I give out the banknotes essentially as promotional material because their dollar used to be worth the same as ours. But what is a dollar? It's just a promise. It's just a representation of ideas.
Did you say you give their banknotes away as promotional materials?
Their currency has become worthless. People, as you said, are literally starving in the streets. It's not because the water is so different down there or that there's something environmental that happens in Caracas. It's because of the ideas.
Didn't the same thing happen in Russia? Because they sit on a bunch of natural resources as well, right?
Sure. But, of course, the Soviet Union, communism, succeeded in killing. By the time the Soviet Union came to its end at the end of the Cold War, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of people had died, and certainly America had gone on to become, these stories about, Gorbachev, et cetera, coming to America during the end of the Cold War and being amazed by all the produce and it's true because there was literally still breadlines in the Soviet Union at the same time that America was already basking in tremendous prosperity. It's so funny, Michele, because it's not hard to imagine. Look at North and South Korea. Look at that line in the sand of darkness, North Korea, and tremendous prosperity and light in South Korea. It's not because of the water or anything else. It's because of the ideas. Capitalists, now South Korea isn't as capitalist as I'd like, of course, but where capitalism lives, I think where Americanism lives, where people are left free, great prosperity emerges for all. And when government and collectivism rules, it's death and destruction always.
So what do people mean when they say socialism has never been tried correctly? What do they mean when they say that? I really don't know.
They say, "Give me another chance. Give us one more chance to take over your life." And it's false. Venezuela is socialism. It's a kind of a recent textbook example of socialism, but. North Korea is a living, breathing textbook example. You don't have to go back to the old, dusty textbook. Oh, I read about something back in the 1400s. These are living, breathing examples of what happens under socialism. And the Nordic countries, as we talked about before, these are really more mixed economies. Elements of capitalism, elements of socialism. And historically, the more free an economy, the more free a country, always the most prosperous. That's why if you look at the history of the world, America has always been the most prosperous because we've always been the most free. I fear sometimes these days that's a little bit in jeopardy and changing. It could not be the case in the future, but why don't amazing new companies emerge from socialist economies? There is no high-tech sector in socialist economies and government-controlled societies. There's no thinking there. You need a free mind to create something like Facebook.
Do you know these proponents of like, I guess, a new age socialism? Do you know what their rebuttal or argument is for Venezuela or these countries where it's failed? Do you know what they say towards that and why that's not what they're trying to do? Why that's not the right kind of socialism?
I don't know what their specific rebuttal is, but it all starts with the question that Rand starts with in the book. The basic premise today is, who owns your life? Individualism or collectivism? Are we all in it together, or do you have a right to your own life? You're very limited time on this earth. So, they would say, well, it's because there was government corruption. I imagine they'd say, because they would come up with some excuse, but it's always some excuse to appeal basically to your sympathy, to your altruism. Ayn Rand writes and talks about quite a bit of, why? Well, what if people fall through the cracks? What if this and that? It's always used as the excuse to, get you to give up your life, give up your rights, give up those principles, and that's where it always starts.
Yeah.
And ends disastrously every time.
There's a few other questions that I thought were really interesting, more on the social issues spectrum. One of them was it racial prejudice un-American?
Sure.
Was the question?
Of course. I am infuriated when I hear people, young people especially, will say, "Oh, don't you know?" I don't even want to repeat it because it's an insult, but there's a sense that somehow Americanism and racism are them. Now, America, of course, there was slavery in America was founded. We fought a tremendous bloody war to eradicate slavery from America, thankfully. That was the right moral thing to do, and also from the rest of the world at the same time. I mean, America isn't about, and this is written, the essay is written by Amy Peikoff in the book, racism it's like a barnyard way of looking at people, isn't it really? Like, well, this color, they think like this, and that color, they think like that. It's an insult to the human mind, and it's not true. I mean, what makes people is not what color of their skin, but it's their ideas, the ideas that they hold. And that's, the capitalist, it's part of what I love about capitalism is that the capitalist doesn't care what color you are, doesn't care what, whether you're man or female or anything, that your sexual preference like that. He or she wants to trade with you. So yes, this idea of judging people based on a biologic predisposition or a biological entity is, I think, completely un-American.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point about the Constitution, is that it's like they wrote it in there. Obviously, they weren't necessarily abiding by it when they had slaves, and women couldn't live completely free lives. But that was interesting that it was written before they even implemented it.
Yes. I mean, there's not. You have to give the founders a little bit of credit in the context of human life on Earth. That there'd always been slavery, since the dawn of time up until this country, and this was a real revolutionary thing. And the ideas were there. I think the founders were missing some of the basic morality to ground them. That's, I think, part of actually what Ayn Rand's genius is, what she has brought. But looking at people based on their race, everyone, left and right, should reject whole cloth. Judging people, anticipating that they feel some way based on their race. Well, they're Jewish. They probably think like this, or I mean, I could go on and on. Doesn't matter. It's such an insult to the human mind. I mean, there's a line, certainly is an Ayn Rand, but I think of the line from Terminator 2. No fate but what we make. And is that terrible?
We'll just say that was from Ayn Rand.
No, well, you and only in this country too, that you have the opportunity, and there's so many examples of it day after day after day. We hear people who started with nothing, started with something, started with whatever they started with, and have made great successes of themselves in America.
You mentioned foreign policy earlier.
Yes.
And I know Alain Journeau wrote the section on that, which we had him on. I'm just going to repeat the question. What should America's goal be for foreign policy?
What is the role of American foreign policy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in Alain's answer, in effect, is government's role, is to keep us safe. I mean, as much as we would prefer not, there's bad actors out there. There's countries out there that would do us harm. There's individuals out there who would do us harm. I mean, Islamic terrorism is just probably the most recent example of it, but there's been others certainly throughout our history, and that is exactly the role of government, is to keep us safe. And if other countries are threatening us, threatening our people, not with, I know the president would say that somehow China is threatening us by selling us low-cost steel. I'm talking about like threatening with bombs, threatening with weapons. I mean, that's exactly the role of government, is to keep us safe. And in fact, capitalist countries historically have always been the least combative, have been the most free and the most peaceful, because there's no reason for a capitalist country to go to war with another country. It's always
because you're trading with them.
You're trading with them. You're benefiting from them. Exactly. You're trading. You're benefiting from them. So I mean, Alain writes, I think, in great detail. I can't do it justice, but in great detail about a proper foreign American policy, and it's very needed, is to keep Americans safe from foreign invaders, from those who would do us harm, and they're out there.
So that's what you would believe to be the really the only role of government, is essentially to keep us safe and to protect our own rights, which in your mind is just not violating someone else's ability to live their own life.
Yeah, I mean, government's role is to protect each of us as individuals, to live our own life as we see fit, not exploiting others, taking advantage of others, always trading with others, but to protect us from force, from fraud. Whether it's a foreign invader who would come and enslave us, or from the pickpocket who would rip us off. I mean, they're violating our rights as well. So when people say, well, from limited government and individual rights, it's not that you're for, oh, you can just do whatever you want. Of course, government is very important, but its role is very specific. And that's really part of America's genius, is understanding exactly what we need government for. Because up until that point, it was basically the whim, whatever the Pope thinks is good, whatever the king thinks is good, whatever the leading intellectuals of the day think are good. America isn't about the public. It's about each individual. And that's government's very important, but very specific role. Keep us free and keep us safe.
I've heard somebody say this too, and you kind of echoed this earlier on when we were talking about elections. I heard this in 2016 during the presidential election. Obviously, the country was just, it was so energized over it. And I heard some people say, the fact that it's such a big deal to people on who gets elected into office is really telling at how much control the government has.
Yes.
Because in theory, it shouldn't matter who's in office. Exactly. If the government, if you say, like, let's say the government was only about protecting us and our rights.
Exactly.
It really shouldn't matter that much who gets in office.
I agree with that. I mean, if there was a proper understanding of government's role, a real true American understanding of government, you would know that its role is really limited and there's really not too much it can do. But we're in this environment now, and there's anything goes. And if the president, if Congress gets a great idea, a big idea of how they want to spend your money, force you, then anything goes. So yes, I think in a proper American society, there wouldn't be this threat that someone could come to power. I mean, that's part of the beauty. There's a lot written in the book about the beauty of the system of checks and balances, is that we're not a country that's governed by men. This is that we're governed by laws, not by men. And so this is not in its purpose and its founding a country where someone can come to power and be a dictator. Those boundaries, I think, are pushed more and more and more. But it starts philosophically. I mean, what are your choices now these days? It's either I am my brother's keeper, collectivism, or country first, also collectivism. We'll know when we have won when we have politicians who say, I'm campaigning for every individual's right to live his or her own life and to pursue his happiness and reach his American dream. That would be, we're a few decades away, but.
Yeah. Do you think we need a new political party?
I think no. I mean, do we need a new political party? I mean, people say that. They'll also say, like, well, what we need is term limits. You hear that often too. Well, we need term limits. I think that's actually irrelevant. I mean, unfortunately, politics is one of the places that there is a lot of regulation. It's very difficult to run for government. Certainly, president, thanks to a lot of the regulations on, for example, campaign finance reform. If you want to donate to someone, you have to fill out forms. I mean, so even the government or elections themselves are highly regulated. I don't think it's necessarily we need a new party. We need new ideas. Individualism is a very radical idea, tremendously radical. It's why it's almost absent from the American politic today. You don't hear anyone talking about it. But when you sit people down and ask them, what do you think about a country? Oftentimes it will come out. So I do think that there's an audience out there. I think that there's excitement about individualism. If people are kind of given permission to accept it once again, to say, I'm not my brother's keeper and you're not my keeper, and we're all free and we're all gonna make the best life we can. And that's real American spirit.
What do you think of the Libertarian Party?
They're insignificant and unprincipled and
oh, really? You think so?
A joke and irrelevant. I mean, if the Libertarian Party was ever going to have an impact, they couldn't have had it in 2016. When everyone hated both candidates, presidential candidates, and the Libertarian Party, I think it's because it starts not with the party. It starts with the ideas. It starts with kids now who are 17, 18, 19 years old, who are just learning about these ideas, who, God willing, in 4 or 5 or 6 years, then can get together and inspire a movement that can ultimately inspire a party and candidates to represent these ideas. But there's almost like no shortcut. You can't get to the electors, you can't get to the legislators you want until people have the ideas, i.e. individualism, that they really need to have.
What do you think about the Electoral College system?
I don't have an explicit view on it. I think it makes sense in its design, but I am not well-versed enough in it to really speak specifically about it. Yeah, no, I mean, the founders were tremendous geniuses. I mean, huge geniuses. You just can't get around it. And it's why, even now, people are swimming to get here, caravanning to get here, flying to get here, dying to get here, and we should welcome them. We should welcome here. You know, this country is basically empty. I think everything west of what the Mississippi is half owned by the government anyway. So
really?
Yeah, but this country is tremendous, uninhabited, vast, wide swaths of country.
Some people here in LA need to go.
Yeah, sure, then to go
there.
out there. Yeah. Wow. Well, you get it. I mean, we were talking about it a bit before. Well, yeah, I mean, you get a great value oftentimes in living in urban environments. It's one of the great things about.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and just about this country is the influx of foreigners and new talents and new skills and new cuisines and new opportunities and ideas. So I mean, this, you know, and very quickly those become American. You know, whether it's, you know, it's a great example of America truly is at its best the melting pot.
Gotcha. Wow. Well, Jonathan, is there anything else that you want to get out there, that you want to talk about that we didn't touch on?
No, I think we've you know, you've terrific interviewer. I mean, you know, I'll say if I could, I mean, when I was in college, everyone who kind of wanted to virtue signal that they were into ideas had Communist Manifesto. So this was the book that kind of people said, oh, see, and I think many of them read it because young people are interested in ideas. They are curious about it. And in this is exactly what, you know, what a new Textbook of Americanism is about. It's a short, really accessible primer for people to start, who are interested in ideas, learning about America, learning about some of these ideas, to start to question and ask some of these basic fundamental principles. So for people in their 20s and 30s, high school kids, this is a great first step into introducing something that's going to be very radical for them, but truly very American.
Yeah, and like I mentioned at the start, its question-answer format is kind of a really simple breakdown, really, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Ayn Rand at all is that you say, I'm really into Ayn Rand, and then you show people Atlas Shrugged, which is, I don't know, 1,200 pages, and some people find that a little bit of a turnoff.
Yeah.
And I can understand that. So this is a tremendous introduction, I think, to Ayn Rand, but also it's just simply to individualism, which is a radical concept that's so fresh for young minds and one that will really inspire a lot of people.
Great. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Jonathan,
Thanks,
for coming on. That was really great.
My pleasure. Thank you. Cool.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.